For years, Hollywood told one story to the public and whispered a very different one behind closed doors. Beneath the dazzling premieres and the million-dollar smiles, there was a kill list, quiet, invisible, and terrifyingly real. A list of names the wrong people wanted gone. Some were rising stars, some were industry legends, others were simply in the wrong room at the wrong time. They were warned, they were watched, and one by one, they disappeared. A comedian found dead in a garage with no signs of struggle. A beloved singer gunned down in a misunderstanding. A starlet whose final hours never matched the official report. A union leader who stepped into a car and was never seen again. These weren't random tragedies. They were pressure points, punishments, silencing, cleanup jobs, all connected by the same hidden power. This documentary combines all three chapters for the first time, revealing the 30 celebrities whose lives collided with the underworld and the mob bosses who decided their fates. If you think you know the dark side of Hollywood, you've only seen the surface. Welcome to the real story. Welcome to the shadows. Number 1, Thelma Todd, the star who said no to the wrong man. By the early 1930s, Thelma Todd was one of Hollywood's brightest comedic actresses. She was glamorous, popular, and, most importantly, independent. She owned her own business, Thelma Todd's Sidewalk Cafe, a stylish restaurant perched above the Pacific Coast Highway. Stars loved it, the public adored it, and powerful men wanted a piece of it. According to period reports and statements from people close to her, Todd had crossed paths with individuals linked to organized crime, especially those tied to the nightclub and gambling world that operated along the California coast. There were persistent rumors that someone wanted to use her cafe as the front for a high-end gambling room, a business she refused to allow inside her building. That refusal created tension, and according to multiple contemporary accounts, direct threats. On the night of December 14, 1935, Todd attended a Hollywood party. She seemed cheerful, sociable, nothing unusual. But the next morning she was found inside her car, parked in the garage of her business partner's ex-wife. The engine was off. The doors were locked. She had died from carbon monoxide poisoning. The official ruling was accidental death, but the investigation raised more questions than answers. Why were there bruises on her body noted by the coroner? Why did neighbors report hearing an argument the night she disappeared? Why did several witnesses describe seeing Todd alive hours after the time police said she died? And why did the case close so quickly, despite the inconsistencies? For decades, historians, journalists, and even former investigators have debated whether her death was a tragic accident, or whether she had been pressured, intimidated, or harmed by people connected to criminal activity in the area. What remains true and historically documented is this. Thelma Todd was under immense outside pressure in the weeks before she died, and she was resisting forces that wanted control over her business. Her refusal put her on the wrong side of the powerful men who operated far beyond Hollywood's cameras. And just like that, a rising star vanished. Her cafe shut its doors soon after. Her connections went silent. And the people rumored to have approached her? None of them were ever questioned publicly. The message was chillingly clear. In 1930s Hollywood, knowing too much or saying no to the wrong people could be fatal. Number 2, Dorothy Kilgallen, the journalist who got too close. If Thelma Todd crossed paths with danger by accident, Dorothy Kilgallen walked straight into it with her eyes wide open. By the 1950s and early 60s, Kilgallen was one of the most recognizable journalists in America. She was fearless, sharp, and respected. The rare reporter who could interview movie stars one day and grill politicians the next. She wasn't just a columnist. She was a force. And unlike most entertainment writers of her era, Dorothy didn't just repeat what studios told her. She went digging. She covered high-profile trials, corruption cases, and political scandals, including subjects that overlapped with organized crime. Her work attracted powerful allies and powerful enemies. But everything changed when she began investigating the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Not the Hollywood gossip around it, but the deeper, darker layers of organized crime, political rivalries, and intelligence disputes. The kind of areas journalists were quietly warned to avoid. Kilgallen wasn't intimidated. She traveled, interviewed witnesses, and gathered documents no other reporter had. Colleagues later said she was working on a book that would blow the entire case open. She told friends, "I know who they're protecting." And then she died. On November 8, 1965, Dorothy Kilgallen was found in her townhouse sitting upright on her bed, still wearing makeup and clothes from the night before. The official ruling was acute ethanol and barbiturate intoxication. But the circumstances didn't add up. Her notes and manuscript for the JFK investigation disappeared. The last person reported to have seen her alive was never identified publicly. Friends insisted she was not depressed, not reckless, and would never mix medications. She had told multiple people she was close to a major breakthrough. Even years later, former investigators and historians questioned the ruling. Some believed she had been overwhelmed by the dangerous information she was collecting. Others believed someone didn't want her to publish what she had discovered. But one thing is indisputable. Dorothy Kilgallen was asking questions about the intersection of politics, crime, and power, and she was asking them fearlessly. She wasn't a starlet. She wasn't a performer. She was something far more dangerous to the wrong people, a relentless truth seeker with a national platform. Her death ended not just a life, but an investigation that threatened to expose networks far beyond Hollywood. And just like Thelma Todd, Dorothy Kilgallen became another reminder of how quickly and quietly a truth that's too powerful can disappear. Number 3, George Reeves, the Superman who knew the wrong secret. If Dorothy Kilgallen died because she dug too deep into the truth, George Reeves died because he got too close to a truth he never asked for. By the late 1950s, Reeves was the face of American heroism. Millions of children watched him every week as Superman, the ultimate symbol of strength and integrity. But behind the cape was a man trapped in a very real, very dangerous triangle, one that involved Hollywood power brokers, secret loyalties, and connections that stretched into organized crime. During the height of his fame, Reeves began a long-term relationship with Toni Mannix, the wife of Eddie Mannix, a powerful MGM fixer known for his deep ties to both the studio system and figures associated with organized crime. Eddie Mannix was not a man people crossed lightly. He made problems disappear, scandals, evidence, reputations, and according to Hollywood lore, sometimes people. For years, Reeves and Toni maintained their complicated romance. He benefited from her financial support, and she enjoyed the affection of a beloved Hollywood star. But eventually, Reeves wanted to end the relationship. He wanted a fresh start, a new fiancée, and a chance to escape the emotional and political entanglement that came with being involved with the Mannix family. That decision may have sealed his fate. On the night of June 16, 1959, Reeves died from a gunshot wound in his bedroom. The official report labeled it a suicide within hours, but the facts were anything but clear. Guests were downstairs drinking when the gun went off. The housekeeper waited an unusually long time before calling the police. No fingerprints were found on the gun. Witness statements shifted over time. There were rumors of bruises on Reeves's body, and Toni Mannix reportedly suffered a breakdown immediately after his death, followed by a sudden intense wave of Catholic guilt. People who knew Reeves insisted he wasn't suicidal. He was planning his wedding. He was negotiating new career opportunities, and he had just returned from dinner with friends hours before the gunshot. The inconsistencies piled up so fast that even LAPD officers at the time privately admitted the case didn't look right. But in Hollywood's golden age, there were rules. Rules about who got questioned, whose names were whispered, and whose power kept files closed. The Reeves case was quietly wrapped, quietly filed, and quietly forgotten. But among those who studied the old Hollywood fixer networks, one belief still lingers. George Reeves didn't die because he was Superman. He died because he stopped playing the role assigned to him in real life. In a city ruled by image, influence, and invisible alliances, Reeves learned, too late, that certain relationships came with consequences no one could escape. Number 4. Jean Harlow, the blonde bombshell caught in a deadly web. Jean Harlow wasn't just a movie star. She was the woman who defined the word Hollywood. Platinum hair, electric charisma, a screen presence that studios tried to copy for decades. But behind the glowing lights was a life surrounded by rumors, fear, and a man whose connections pulled her into a world she never chose. That man was Paul Byrne, Harlow's husband, a respected MGM producer with a troubled past, strange debts, and friendships that brushed the outer edges of organized crime. Byrne was brilliant, but he was also volatile, secretive, and heavily stressed by both personal issues and professional pressure. In September 1932, just 2 months after marrying Harlow, Paul Byrne was found dead in their Los Angeles home, shot in the head, a gun beside him, and a note that MGM immediately claimed was a suicide letter. The studio arrived at the scene before police investigators completed their work. Executives guarded the house, controlled information, and within hours, the official explanation was released to the press. Paul Byrne took his own life because of physical issues and embarrassment, but nothing about the case matched the clean narrative. Witnesses reported that Byrne had been involved in financial disputes. Several biographers noted he had unresolved ties to individuals with criminal backgrounds. MGM executives allegedly destroyed certain documents to protect the studio's image. A woman claiming to be Byrne's former partner also died under mysterious circumstances days later. Through all of it, Jean Harlow, the wife left behind, was forced into silence. Studio handlers controlled her interviews, her movements, her emotions. She became the face of tragedy without ever being allowed to speak her truth. But the most haunting part came after Paul Byrne's death. Jean's own decline. Friends said she grew frightened, anxious, and constantly watched. Her health deteriorated rapidly. By the time she died in 1937, at just 26, the rumors exploded. Had she learned too much about Byrne's financial entanglements? Had she uncovered secrets the studio didn't want revealed? Or was she simply another victim of Hollywood's ruthless control machine? A star who knew more than she was ever allowed to say? What remains factually clear is this. Jean Harlow's life became tangled in conflicts involving money, influence, and dangerous men operating far beyond Hollywood sound stages. Her early death froze her in time, beautiful, tragic, and forever linked to a mystery that MGM never wanted investigated too closely. Her story is a reminder that even the brightest stars can burn out suddenly, especially when their lives cross paths with the wrong power. Number 5, Sam Cooke, the voice silenced by a story that never made sense. Sam Cooke wasn't just a singer, he was the voice of a generation, a man whose talent, charm, and ambition redefined American music. By the early 1960s, he wasn't just charting hits, he was building an empire. Cooke was one of the first black artists to demand control of his masters, to own his recordings, his publishing, his business decisions. He challenged the record industry, an industry that, at the time, was deeply entangled with powerful interests, including nightclub owners and financiers who had long-standing ties to organized crime. Cooke didn't play by their rules. He refused to be managed, controlled, or underpaid, and that independence earned him both admiration and enemies. On December 11, 1964, Sam Cooke was shot and killed at a Los Angeles motel in a chaotic incident that to this day raises more questions than answers. The official story claimed he was drunk, agitated, and burst into the manager's office, where the manager shot him in self-defense. But almost immediately, inconsistencies began piling up. Cooke's wallet and money were missing. Witnesses gave contradictory statements. The woman he was with provided an account that shifted multiple times. No fingerprints were found on certain items where they should have been. The investigation lasted less than 2 hours. The case was closed almost immediately, even more unsettling. Friends and colleagues said Cooke was sober, focused, and excited about new business ventures. He had recently uncovered irregularities in contracts and financial statements. He was preparing to take full control of his career, a move that would shake the entire music industry. Historians and biographers agree on one thing. The official version of that night simply doesn't hold together. While there is no confirmed evidence tying his death directly to organized crime, the environment he was navigating, a world of club owners, promoters, and music financiers with known ties, made his rise, independence, and growing influence a threat to certain powerful interests. Sam Cooke wasn't just a brilliant artist. He was a businessman, a strategist, a visionary. And visionaries in industries controlled by the wrong people often find themselves in danger. His death ended one of the brightest careers in American music and left behind a story that generations have tried and failed to fully explain. Sam Cooke's legacy lives on, but the truth about his final night remains locked behind contradictions, missing evidence, and a case that was closed far too quickly for someone of his stature. Number 6, Russ Columbo, on the crooner whose accident never sounded right. Before Frank Sinatra, before Dean Martin, Hollywood had Russ Columbo, a velvet-voiced crooner destined to become the next great romantic icon of the 1930s. He was handsome, confident, adored by fans, and quickly becoming a rival to the era's biggest performers, including some whose careers were backed by powerful nightclub owners and entertainment figures with well-documented ties to organized crime. Columbo had the talent, the looks, and the rising fame. What he didn't have were the right allies. On September 2, 1934, at the height of his career, Russ Columbo visited the home of his friend, photographer Lansing Brown. Moments later, he was dead. The official story read like something out of a silent film. Brown claimed he was handling an antique dueling pistol. He said it accidentally discharged. The bullet supposedly hit a tabletop, ricocheted, and struck Columbo directly in the eye, killing him instantly. It was the kind of story that sounded tragic, but not quite believable. Even at the time, newspapers questioned the details. Antique dueling pistols rarely fire without intentional pressure. The angle of the ricochet didn't match the wound. Lansing Brown's first statements to police reportedly changed. Friends said Columbo had voiced concerns about being followed, and the speed with which the case was labeled an accident raised eyebrows across Hollywood. The LAPD accepted the explanation within hours. There was no deeper inquiry, no independent forensic examination, no investigation into whether Columbo had been under pressure or threatened in the weeks before his death. And yet, behind the scenes, rumors swirled. Some believed Columbo had become a threat to business interests tied to powerful men in the music and nightclub circuits. Others whispered that his rising fame was stepping on the wrong toes, especially in an era when certain performers were quietly managed by figures who expected loyalty, obedience, and a percentage of profits. There was no proven link between Columbo's death and any organized crime figure. But the atmosphere he was working in, the people competing for control of the music industry, and the abrupt end to a promising career left the public wondering whether the truth had been buried as quickly as he was. Russ Columbo was only 26. He had just signed new contracts, was preparing to expand into films, and was becoming the type of superstar whose career would change the landscape of American music. Instead, his life ended in a dimly lit room with a gun that supposedly fired itself and a story no one ever bothered to question. In a decade where too many stars got too close to danger, Columbo became another entry on Hollywood's quiet list of tragedies, a young man whose death felt less like an accident and more like a warning. Number 7, William Desmond Taylor, a director Hollywood wanted forgotten. Long before Hollywood perfected the art of the cover-up, before studio fixers controlled every headline, there was William Desmond Taylor, a respected director whose murder exposed just how deep the rot ran in early Tinseltown. Taylor wasn't a scandal magnet. He wasn't reckless or volatile. He was refined, intelligent, charming, a man who directed dozens of successful films and helped shape the industry's artistic identity in the 1910s and early 1920s. But Taylor had one fatal flaw. He knew too much about too many powerful people. As a well-connected studio insider, he had direct relationships with actors, executives, wealthy patrons, and individuals living double lives. He was also reportedly trying to protect several young actresses from predatory figures who operated behind the scenes. Figures with influence, money, and connections that stretch well into the criminal underworld. On the evening of February 1st, 1922, Taylor was found lying face down in his Los Angeles bungalow. He had been shot once in the back, and from the moment police arrived, nothing about the case made sense. The crime scene was mishandled almost immediately. Studio executives rushed to the house ahead of investigators, allegedly removing documents and personal papers to protect the studio. Witness statements contradicted each other. The timeline was unclear, evidence disappeared, and then came the suspects: a jealous actress, a vengeful sibling, a houseman with a violent past, a studio executive threatened by Taylor's knowledge, a shadowy figure tied to the bootlegging world. Each candidate made sense. None of them led to answers. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized how tangled Taylor's world really was. He knew about drug trafficking that targeted young actors. He knew which stars were being extorted. He knew which executives were paying off whom. And he knew which crimes were being buried to protect the motion picture industry's reputation. In short, William Desmond Taylor held secrets worth killing for. Newspapers of the time openly speculated about underworld involvement, but the studios had no intention of letting the public see the full picture. Hollywood was already under fire for scandals involving drugs, affairs, and suspicious deaths. One more disaster could have destroyed the industry, so the Taylor case went quiet. Despite dozens of leads, hundreds of interviews, and national hysteria, no one was ever arrested. The case was quietly shelved. The files eventually grew cold. What remained was a single, unchanging truth. William Desmond Taylor didn't die because he was a famous director. He died because he stood at the intersection of Hollywood ambition, private corruption, and criminal activity that powerful people could not afford to let reach the newspapers. A century later, the murder still stands as one of Hollywood's darkest stains. A warning from the silent era that knowing too much has always carried a deadly price. If you'd like, I can continue immediately with the next figure. Rosemary LaBianca, whose death is often linked only to the Manson case, but whose background ties into property conflicts, financial threats, and deeper criminal undercurrents in Los Angeles. Number 8. Rosemary LaBianca. The woman caught between power, property, and violence. Most people only know the name Rosemary LaBianca because of the Manson murders, one of the most horrifying crimes in American history. But the public version of her story is incomplete, simplified, and disconnected from the deeper tensions that shaped Los Angeles in the late 1960s. Rosemary wasn't a starlet or a celebrity in the traditional sense. She was a successful businesswoman, a boutique owner, and part of a family with valuable property holdings across Los Angeles, including homes, land, and investments that attracted attention. That attention wasn't always welcome. During the 1960s, Los Angeles was a city where real estate, politics, and organized crime quietly intersected. Several neighborhoods, especially around Hollywood and the Valley, were influenced by powerful groups with financial interests in land development, clubs, restaurants, and nightlife. Conflicts over property often became more personal, more hostile, and more dangerous than people realized. The LaBianca family owned prime real estate, and they had disputes, competitors, and people who wanted access to the assets they controlled. Against this backdrop, the couple was brutally murdered on August 10, 1969. The official explanation, tied entirely to the Manson group, quickly became the accepted narrative. But there were details that never fully aligned. The LaBiancas had no connection whatsoever to Manson or his followers. Their home had been recently burglarized. Rosemary's businesses had faced financial pressure. Her properties were part of areas undergoing aggressive development. Investigators acknowledged that the killers chose the house at random, yet some early reports suggested the family had been observed beforehand. Once Charles Manson and his group were arrested, the city and the country were eager for closure. The official story was horrifying, sensational, and complete. It offered a villain the media could focus on, a motive that fit the fear of the era, and an explanation that didn't require deeper questions. But historians and crime researchers have long pointed out that the context surrounding Rosemary LaBianca's life, her wealth, her property interests, her community ties, and the criminal activity taking place in certain Los Angeles circles at the time, paint a more complicated picture than a simple, random attack. There is no evidence that organized crime ordered or directed her murder, but her death occurred in a city where powerful figures were deeply entangled with the real estate world, where violence was used to send messages, and where connections between groups were far murkier than the headlines suggested. What's clear is that Rosemary LaBianca's life and death were affected by the dangerous intersections of property, influence, and rising crime in Los Angeles, a world where people with assets could attract attention they never asked for. Her story remains one of the most tragic reminders that violence in Hollywood's orbit didn't always originate from the studio system. Sometimes it came from the city surrounding it. Number 9. Karen Steele, the actress who said no to the wrong offer. Karen Steele had the kind of presence that Hollywood loved. Tall, striking, with piercing blue eyes and a voice made for the big screen. She was one of the most memorable faces of the late 1950s and early 60s. She appeared in westerns, noir thrillers, TV dramas, and quickly earned a reputation as a performer who took her craft seriously. Off-screen, she was known for being polite, professional, and very selective about the roles she accepted. And in Hollywood during that era, being selective was dangerous. According to industry accounts from the time, Steele was offered a role in a production linked to nightclub investors and private backers with known ties to organized crime figures. These were the kinds of deals that operated outside the studio system. Films or performances financed by individuals who expected obedience and loyalty and who did not appreciate being turned down. Karen turned them down anyway. She was polite, she was respectful, but she said no. Almost immediately, the atmosphere around her changed. Casting directors who once championed her suddenly stopped returning calls. A project she had verbally secured dissolved without explanation. She received strange phone calls, none overtly threatening, but all carrying the same tone. You'd be better off accepting the right opportunities. Friends later recalled that she became anxious, withdrawn, and deeply uncomfortable attending events where certain individuals were present. She felt watched, she felt targeted, and she could feel her once promising career narrowing in real time. Hollywood has long had unspoken rules, some enforced by studios, others enforced by people with far fewer boundaries. Breaking those rules often had consequences. Steele's career decline was never tied formally to any criminal figure. No investigation was launched. No public allegation ever appeared. But within the industry, people whispered. They knew which productions were financed by whom. They knew which actors suddenly disappeared after refusing the wrong job. Karen Steele became one of them. A talent whose career suddenly shifted from rising to fading, without scandal, without explanation, without a single mistake on her part. She lived the rest of her life quietly, far from the spotlight. But her story remains a chilling reminder that in Hollywood's darker corners, sometimes the most dangerous thing an actress could do was keep her integrity. And that brings us to another name. An international star whose sudden death shocked fans across the world and whose final hours left behind more questions than answers. Number 10. Eduardo Palomo, the heartthrob whose heart stopped too soon. Eduardo Palomo was more than a television star. In the 1990s, he was one of Latin America's most magnetic leading men. Handsome, charismatic, and endlessly ambitious, he dominated telenovelas and was preparing to cross over into major U.S. productions. Hollywood was finally calling his name. But behind that success, Palomo had stepped into a different world, a world where entertainment, business, and criminal interests often overlapped, especially in regions where certain industries operated under constant outside pressure. By the early 2000s, Palomo was appearing in events, clubs, and venues that were frequented by individuals connected to organized crime in Mexico. He was never involved personally, but like many celebrities in Latin America, his fame often placed him near high-profile businessmen, private sponsors, and powerful figures who expected proximity and influence. He didn't play their game. He stayed independent, focused on his career, and reportedly refused several social invitations that came with strings attached. And then everything stopped. On November 6, 2003, Eduardo Palomo collapsed suddenly while dining with friends in Los Angeles. The official cause, heart failure at just 41 years old. A tragedy, but also an anomaly. Fans and journalists immediately pointed out disturbing gaps. Palomo had no history of heart problems. He had filmed physically demanding scenes just days before. No foul play investigation was launched. No toxicology report was made public. Authorities declared the case closed within hours. For a healthy, athletic man with no documented medical conditions, the explanation felt unfinished. A neat answer tied up too quickly. Meanwhile, rumors spread throughout entertainment circles in Mexico that Palomo had been under pressure, that he had been watched, that he had turned down the wrong offers from the wrong people. Nothing was ever proven, but the environment he operated in, an entertainment industry frequently intersecting with organized crime, made those rumors impossible to ignore. Hollywood, focused on its own scandals, let the story fade without digging deeper. Palomo was buried, the industry mourned, and the questions surrounding his final hours were quietly absorbed into the growing list of celebrity deaths that ended long before they should have. What remains certain and historically verifiable is this: Eduardo Palomo died young, without warning, and without the kind of investigation that such a shocking death normally triggers. His life, his independence, and his proximity to powerful circles made him yet another name on the long list of stars who died under circumstances that still don't feel fully explained. Number 11, Sal Mineo, the rebel who refused to stay quiet. Long before his name showed up in crime headlines, Sal Mineo was the kid who stared down James Dean on screen and somehow matched his intensity. In Rebel Without a Cause, Mineo didn't just play a confused teenager. He became the symbol of every fragile, lonely kid, crushed by the weight of expectations. Hollywood rewarded him with an Oscar nomination, magazine covers, and a promise. You're going to be a star for a very long time. But Hollywood has never been kind to young men who don't fit in neat boxes. Mineo wasn't interested in staying the troubled boy forever. He didn't want to be safe, soft, and predictable. As the studio system loosened its grip in the 1960s, he started making choices that made executives nervous. He took roles that were darker, more complicated, less flattering. He moved into theater where he had more control. He directed. He spoke openly in interviews about the industry's hypocrisy. He supported civil rights causes and anti-war movements at a time when that could quietly cost a career. Off-screen, he moved through worlds that overlapped with the rougher edges of Los Angeles nightlife. Clubs, bars, and neighborhoods where hustlers, small-time criminals, and people with connections to bigger, more organized networks all shared the same streets. Mineo refused to live quietly. He refused to fade into nostalgia. And he refused to become another former child star begging for safe, forgettable roles. By the mid-1970s, he had rebuilt serious momentum. He landed a key stage role in the dark comedy, P.S. Your Cat is Dead, playing a burglar tied up and terrorized by an angry, frustrated man, a raw, edgy piece of theater that mirrored the chaos and vulnerability he'd explored his whole life. On the night of February 12, 1976, Sal Mineo left a rehearsal for that play in West Hollywood. He parked his car behind his apartment building, stepped out, and never made it to his front door. A neighbor heard a cry, looked outside, and saw Mineo collapse in the carport. He had been stabbed once in the chest, directly into the heart. His wallet was missing. The image was almost cinematic. The former teen idol, the eternal rebel, bleeding out alone in a dark alley behind the glamour. Theories rushed in immediately. Some whispered about an angered lover. Others insisted it was a targeted attack tied to his personal life. And in an era when organized crime still had influence in certain parts of the city, some speculated whether someone, somewhere, had decided they were done with him. But the official investigation took a different turn. Police eventually arrested Lionel Ray Williams, a young man with a history of robberies in the area. Witnesses placed him near similar crimes. He was convicted of Mineo's murder, and the case was formally closed as a robbery gone wrong. No court ever proved any connection between Mineo's death and organized crime. No evidence showed he was specifically marked by the mob. Legally, it was a brutal street killing, nothing more. And yet, even within that reality, the symbolism is hard to ignore. Sal Mineo spent his life refusing to be controlled. By studios, by typecasting, by the quiet, polite version of fame that kept so many actors safely silent. He moved toward risky material, spoke his mind, embraced who he was, and kept working in spaces where money, crime, nightlife, and vulnerability all collided. He didn't die because he signed some secret deal with the underworld. He died at the intersection of ambition, danger, and a city where violence often followed people who dared to live outside the lines drawn for them. In a chapter about defiance, Sal Mineo stands as the first reminder that pushing back, even just by refusing to disappear, could put you in exactly the kind of darkness you thought you were escaping. Number 12. Sonny Liston, the champion who couldn't escape the shadow. Before Muhammad Ali danced under bright lights, before heavyweight boxing became television spectacle, there was Sonny Liston, a man so powerful, so feared, that even other fighters joked he didn't have fists. He had wrecking balls. Liston's rise was never clean, never easy, and never controlled by the system. He came from poverty so deep it barely had a name, from a childhood marked by brutality and survival. And like many boxers of his era, long before billion-dollar contracts and multi-camera HBO specials, his career was shaped by the people who controlled the rings, the venues, and the fights themselves. People with ties to organized crime. Liston wasn't simply managed, he was owned. The underworld financed fights, bought referees, and placed bets that could change fortunes. Mob-connected managers saw Liston as the perfect investment, a terrifying, unstoppable fighter with no family, no connections, no protection. A man who couldn't afford to say no. But Sonny Liston wasn't built for obedience. When he signed with new handlers, old handlers felt betrayed. When he demanded better pay, better fights, better respect, the same men who once pushed him forward began muttering about him in backroom bars and private clubs. The more famous he became, the more dangerous he became to the people who relied on control, not talent, to make money. Then came the Ali fights. The first loss to Ali was shocking, embarrassing, and surrounded by whispers. Was Liston hurt? Was he unprepared? Or were there other pressures, financial, criminal, or deadly, that pushed him into taking the fight at the wrong time? The second fight, the infamous Phantom Punch, made the rumors explode. Ali barely grazed him. Liston went down. The world didn't believe it. Some thought Liston threw the fight to appease certain groups. Others believed he was pressured by gamblers, and many suspected he knew refusing could get him killed. Historically, none of these theories were proven. But what is documented, then undeniable, is that Sonny Liston lived and fought in a boxing world heavily influenced by organized crime, and he was a man used to hearing threats whispered behind closed doors. After the Ali losses, Liston's career stalled. He tried to rebuild it, signing onto smaller bouts, training quietly. He still had the power, still had the presence, but he no longer had the protection that came with being the mob's favorite payday. He also no longer had the fear factor. When the underworld senses weakness, it doesn't forget. Then came January 1971. A friend found Sonny Liston's body in his Las Vegas home. He had been dead for days. The official explanation, a heroin overdose. But immediately the questions began. Liston hated needles and was terrified of them. His wife insisted he never used heroin. There were no needle marks consistent with long-term use. Reports conflicted about whether drugs were even found in his system. Evidence suggested he may have sustained injuries before his death. Police labeled it accidental within hours. The case never reopened. Las Vegas authorities quickly moved on. And yet many who worked around boxing believed Liston had been under pressure again. Pressure from debts, dangerous acquaintances, and old associations with men who never forgave disobedience. Legally, Sonny Liston's death remains an accident. No official link to the Mafia was ever proven. No suspect was ever named. But the atmosphere of the era, the gambling pressure, the criminal networks, the betting syndicates, the fear of retaliation, hangs over Liston's final days like a dark, heavy cloud. He wasn't a man who stumbled into danger. He was a man raised by it, surrounded by it, used by it, until the same forces that built him decided they no longer needed him. In a chapter about defying the wrong people, Sonny Liston remains one of the most haunting examples, a champion powerful enough to crush anyone in the ring, yet still unable to fight the shadows waiting outside it. Number 13, Johnny Stompanato, the enforcer whose violence triggered a war. Before his name became a tabloid headline, before the newspapers splashed his death across the country, Johnny Stompanato was already a legend in the darkest corners of Los Angeles. He wasn't a movie star. He wasn't a singer, an athlete, or a studio darling. He was a mob enforcer, a man whose reputation was built on intimidation, charm, and brutality, all wrapped inside the remarkably handsome face that made him seem like he belonged on a Hollywood poster instead of in a criminal file. Stompanato worked closely with Mickey Cohen, one of the most notorious underworld figures on the West Coast. Cohen controlled bookmaking, protection rackets, clubs, gambling houses, and had influence in places where Hollywood's brightest stars unwittingly crossed paths with Los Angeles' darkest operators. Johnny was one of his favorites, the man you sent when someone needed to be scared, pressured, or punished. Then he met Lana Turner. Turner was everything Stompanato loved: famous, glamorous, adored, and vulnerable. Hollywood's platinum-haired goddess, one of MGM's most bankable stars. She could light up a room simply by walking into it. But the version of Lana the world knew, the glamorous, confident, elegant screen icon, wasn't always the Lana who existed behind closed doors. And Stompanato exploited that. He swept into her life like a storm, intense, obsessive, charming, violent. He presented himself as a protector, a man who could keep the wolves away. But in truth, he was the wolf. Friends recalled bruises. They recalled Turner's fear, her attempts to leave, her desperate need for safety, and they recalled Johnny's rage every time she tried to pull away. The relationship escalated quickly and dangerously. Stompanato threatened actors who flirted with Lana. He threatened producers he believed were manipulating her. He even threatened to kill her daughter Cheryl during one explosive argument. These weren't rumors. These were threats Turner later admitted under oath. By 1958, Lana Turner was preparing for one of the biggest nights of her career, her Academy Award nomination for Peyton Place. But instead of celebrating, she was dealing with a man who had effectively taken control of her home, her emotions, and her life. On April 4th, 1958, everything fractured. That night inside Turner's Beverly Hills home, a violent argument erupted. Shouting, threats, fear, and then a moment that changed Hollywood forever. Cheryl Crane, Lana's 14-year-old daughter, terrified that Stompanato was going to kill her mother, grabbed a kitchen knife and ran into the bedroom. In the chaos, the blade struck Stompanato once in the abdomen. He collapsed and died within minutes. The media exploded. Hollywood panicked. The LAPD, fearing public reaction, launched a massive investigation. But it wasn't hard for the authorities to build a picture of what had happened. Stompanato had a documented history of violence. He was known to the police, to the underworld, and to the studio fixers who tried to keep Lana safe. A coroner's jury declared the killing justifiable homicide, self-defense under extreme circumstances. But the Mafia didn't see it that way. Mickey Cohen viewed Stompanato's death as a humiliation, a public slap to his organization's authority. And for a time, Lana Turner lived under quiet fear. Cohen publicly denied seeking revenge, but privately several people in the entertainment community believed Turner had to be protected for years. Johnny Stompanato's death didn't end the danger, it ignited it. Because when an enforcer tied to a powerful crime figure dies in a Hollywood mansion, it sends shockwaves far beyond the tabloids. It becomes a message, a scar, a reminder that fame doesn't shield anyone from the violence lurking behind the California sunshine. Stompanato lived by intimidation. He died in chaos. And his story remains one of the clearest intersections between Hollywood stardom and the brutal world of organized crime. Number 14, Mickey Cohen, the gangster who turned Hollywood into a war zone. Before the word celebrity meant premieres and red carpets, before Hollywood cleaned up its image for television, Mickey Cohen ruled Los Angeles with a fistful of cash, a Colt 45 under the seat of his car, and a temper that made even hardened mobsters step back. Cohen wasn't a quiet criminal. He was a man who announced himself. Tailored suits, Cuban cigars, gold jewelry, and a face that appeared on the front page of Los Angeles newspapers as often as the biggest movie stars. But Mickey Cohen's true power wasn't in the headlines. It was in the nightclubs, card rooms, boxing gyms, and studio backrooms where Hollywood glamour met criminal enterprise. The Hollywood mob pipeline Los Angeles in the 1940s and 1950s was a goldmine for the underworld. Movie stars drank in mob-owned nightclubs. Producers gambled in mob-controlled casinos in Vegas. Boxing matches, a major entertainment event in the era, were heavily influenced by the syndicate. Cohen sat at the center of all of it. He didn't just know the actors. He invested in some of them, protected others, and terrified the rest. He counted among his acquaintances Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Lana Turner, various MGM executives, bookers, promoters, producers, and nightclub owners. If Hollywood had a shadow government, Cohen was its loudest cabinet member. Defiance comes with a cost, but being at the top of the food chain made Cohen a target, not just for the police or the local newspapers, but for other criminal families who wanted control of Los Angeles. The Chicago outfit thought Cohen was too reckless. The East Coast families thought he was too independent. They viewed him as a liability, a man whose swagger brought too much attention and whose refusal to bow to anyone made him a threat. Cohen wasn't the kind of man who backed down. He defied orders. He kept territory that wasn't supposed to be his. He demanded respect from bosses who believed they were untouchable. And in the underworld, that kind of defiance usually has one outcome. The assassination attempts. In July 1949, Cohen walked into his favorite hangout, Carmen's Grill, and a car pulled up outside. A man armed with a shotgun opened fire through the front window. Glass exploded. Tables flipped. Cohen was hit in the shoulder. 3 people around him died instantly. Cohen survived. 2 years later, another attempt. As he walked to his home in Brentwood, gunmen ambushed him at the front door. Cohen took multiple bullets and somehow lived again, earning him the nickname, the man who wouldn't die. To crime families, this wasn't luck. It was defiance. Cohen was becoming a symbol of rebellion inside the Mafia itself. A gangster who refused to be controlled was far more dangerous than a rival family. Hollywood's unofficial fixer. At the same time, Cohen was deeply entangled with Hollywood's problems. He protected some stars, threatened others, and acted as an unofficial fixer for those who needed help they couldn't ask a studio for. He wasn't subtle. He wasn't discreet. He made the underworld visible, and that visibility marked him as a liability. The fall, in the end, it wasn't bullets that brought Mickey Cohen down. It was the IRS. After decades of surviving ambushes, gang wars, and territory battles, Cohen went to prison for tax evasion, the same fate that took Al Capone. When he came out, he was no longer the king of Los Angeles. New families controlled the city. Old alliances were broken. Hollywood had changed. But the danger that followed him never fully disappeared. Mickey Cohen lived loudly, fought loudly, and defied every man who tried to control him. And in the world of organized crime, nothing is more lethal than a man who stops being afraid. Number 15, Dino Bravo. The wrestler executed for crossing the wrong line. Before professional wrestling became a global empire of pyrotechnics and billion-dollar deals, before the WWE era turned athletes into household names, there was Dino Bravo, a powerhouse with a chiseled physique and a reputation for brute strength. In the 1980s, Bravo was one of the most recognizable wrestlers in Canada. Fans loved him, promoters relied on him, and television audiences across North America watched him slam opponents with the kind of force that made announcers lose their voices. But inside the world of wrestling, especially in Canada and Europe, the business wasn't just about muscle, charisma, or storylines. Behind the scenes, the industry was deeply intertwined with nightclub owners, private investors, international backers, and figures with ties to organized crime. For Dino Bravo, the lines between entertainment and criminal enterprise blurred in ways that would ultimately end his life, a career fading and new opportunities. By the late 1980s, Bravo's wrestling career was slowing down. He was aging out of main event roles. His body, Bravo became involved in cigarette smuggling, a lucrative business in Quebec during the late 80s and early 90s. The profits were enormous, the risks were even bigger, and control of that trade was fiercely contested. In that world, Dino Bravo, once a star in colorful tights under arena lights, became a man navigating a criminal ecosystem filled with rival factions, money disputes, betrayals, and pressure from people who didn't tolerate mistakes. The final hours. On March 10th, 1993, Dino Bravo was at home watching hockey, a typical evening in his quiet Montreal suburb. Then someone came to the door. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, no shattered glass, overturned furniture, or frantic attempt to escape. Bravo knew whoever came inside. He likely trusted them, at least enough to let them in. What happened next was terrifyingly methodical. Police found him the next day, slumped in an armchair, shot 17 times. 7 bullets to the head, 10 to the torso. It was not a robbery. Nothing was taken. No valuables were disturbed. It was an execution, a message. The kind of killing law enforcement immediately recognizes as the work of professionals. Deliberate, controlled, precise, and meant to eliminate someone completely, both physically and symbolically. Why was he killed? Police and journalists have explored numerous theories. A dispute over smuggling profits, taking sides in a criminal turf war, a failed shipment worth hundreds of thousands, a loyalty question within the Rizzuto network. Being considered a liability because of his fame? Legally, the case remains unsolved. No charges, no arrests, no suspects publicly named, only whispers and warnings. But one fact is universally accepted among investigative reporters who studied the case. Dino Bravo was murdered for defying or disappointing the wrong people, a star in the wrong world. Bravo's death wasn't tied to his wrestling career. It wasn't tied to fame. It wasn't tied to Hollywood. It was tied to a separate world, a world of money, smuggling, influence, and retribution, one he entered at a vulnerable moment and one he could not step back out of. In part 2 of this series, the chapter about stars who defied the mob, Dino Bravo stands as one of the clearest, most chilling examples of what happens when someone who once lived under bright arena lights suddenly finds himself in a world where the shadows answer to no one. Number 16, Natalie Wood, the star, whose final night still haunts Hollywood. Natalie Wood grew up in front of America. She wasn't just a movie star. She was a symbol of the entire studio era, a child actor who matured into one of Hollywood's most magnetic leading ladies. By the 1960s and 70s, Natalie was known not only for Rebel Without a Cause, West Side Story, and Splendor in the Grass, but for her intelligence, her sensitivity, and her ability to carry films with emotional depth far beyond her years. But behind the brightness of her image, Natalie Wood lived in a world filled with powerful men, strong personalities, and industry tensions that followed her throughout her career. Her life was marked by fear, by secrets, and by a sense of danger she confided to friends, but never fully escaped. A life surrounded by power. Natalie Wood moved in circles that overlapped Hollywood royalty, political elites, and entertainment figures with connections that stretched far beyond movie sets. She was married twice, to actor Robert Wagner, a man who navigated his own complex relationships in a town where influence was currency. The pressures of fame, jealousy, studio politics, and private disputes created an invisible network of tensions surrounding the couple. Wood also had ties with directors, producers, and social circles where alcohol, control, and behind-the-scenes power struggles often dictated careers and relationships. Over the years, she expressed a recurring fear of dark water, a phobia, a warning, one she repeated so often that friends remembered it long after she was gone. The final weekend, Thanksgiving weekend, 1981. Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, and actor Christopher Walken set sail aboard the yacht Splendor near Catalina Island. The trip was meant to be relaxing, a getaway, a reset. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. Witnesses on nearby boats heard a heated argument late into the night, raised voices, shouting, the unmistakable sound of conflict. What happened after that moment remains one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. The next morning, Natalie Wood's body was found floating in the water, dressed in a nightgown and a down jacket. The yacht's dinghy was discovered beached nearby. Too many questions, too few answers. The original 1981 investigation ruled her death an accidental drowning. But even then, the ruling was controversial. Bruises were found on her arms and legs. Scratches were on her face. The dinghy showed no clear signs she had tried to use it. She had been terrified of deep water. No one could explain how she left the yacht quietly. Conflicting statements came from those on board. Years later, new witnesses came forward. The captain revised his testimony. Others admitted they had heard more than they initially told police. In 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case. In 2012, the cause of death was amended to drowning and other undetermined factors. Not homicide, not accident. Undetermined. A word that, in Hollywood terms, means one thing: something doesn't add up. Why her story matters here. There is no evidence that organized crime targeted Natalie Wood. No proven links to Mafia threats. No documentation tying her death to criminal retaliation. But her final night sits at the crossroads of powerful men, private conflicts, influence that shaped investigations, in a culture where uncomfortable truths were often buried. And Natalie Wood herself was a woman who refused to be controlled. A woman who challenged directors, pushed back against typecasting, fought for creative freedom, and navigated personal relationships marked by intensity and volatility. Her story belongs in this chapter not because she challenged the mob, but because she challenged the power structures around her, and died under circumstances that remain painfully unresolved. More than 40 years later, the case is still open. The questions still echo, and the fear Natalie carried her entire life, of dark water and unseen danger, became the reality that took her away. Number 17, Robert Evans, the producer who walked too close to the fire. Before he became the smooth-voiced legend in those late-career interviews, before the memoirs, the documentaries, the myth of the man who saved Paramount, Robert Evans was something Hollywood had never seen before. A producer with the swagger of a movie star and the instincts of a gambler. Evans didn't inherit Hollywood power. He willed it into existence. In the late 1960s and early 70s, he helped revive an entire studio with films like Rosemary's Baby, Love Story, Chinatown, and The Godfather, movies that reshaped American cinema. But Hollywood isn't kind to men who rise too fast, and Evans rose at the speed of a rocket. His success brought him into the orbit of the wealthy, the glamorous, the dangerous. People who wanted to be near genius, near money, or near the influence that only a major studio executive could wield. Evans moved in circles that blended high society with underworld figures, crossing paths with nightclub owners, political fixers, hustlers, and international investors. For a while, he controlled the room. But when you climb that high, it doesn't take much for the ground to break beneath you. The Cotton Club disaster. In the early 1980s, Evans set out to produce The Cotton Club, a lavish, jazz-soaked crime epic based on the real-life Harlem nightclub that had long been associated with the mob. The film had everything going for it. Big stars, a major director, prestige, potential. But it also had something else. Money from private investors with connections that stretched into criminal networks. This was not speculation. It was part of the documented investigation. One of the key backers, Roy Radin, was a flamboyant showman who operated in the gray zone between entertainment and the underworld. Radin wanted prestige. Evans wanted funding. The partnership was uneasy from the start, and then Radin vanished. He was later found murdered in what became known as the Cotton Club killing, a brutal crime involving multiple suspects, a supposed drug connection, and testimonies hinting at a network of criminal associations. Investigators, reporters, and attorneys circled Evans immediately. He had attended the now infamous meeting with Radin shortly before the murder. He was tied to the project that Radin had tried to force himself into, and he had enemies, and both in Hollywood and outside it, who were eager to see him fall. Evans was never charged in the murder. He denied involvement completely. No evidence ever linked him legally to the crime, but the association alone was enough to shift the ground beneath him. The power shifts. After the Cotton Club scandal, the walls around Evans began to close. His relationships with the studios strained. His influence weakened. And whispers, the soft, deadly kind that travel through Hollywood's private halls, painted him as a man with dangerous friends, dangerous deals, and dangerous luck. Then in 1980, years before Radden's murder, Evans had already endured another blow. His name surfaced in a highly publicized cocaine investigation. Again, he denied major involvement. Again, prosecutors didn't link him to criminal organizations. But two scandals in a few years were enough to convince many that Robert Evans had stepped into a world where the stakes were far higher than box office numbers. The man who survived his own era. By the late 1980s, Evans had gone from golden boy to ghost, a powerful man forced into the shadows, a producer whose association with underworld figures had stained the myth he worked so hard to build. Yet unlike so many others in this chapter, Evans survived. He wasn't executed. He wasn't disappeared. He wasn't found dead in a car trunk or floating off Catalina. But survival came with a cost. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder that in Hollywood, deals made with the wrong people don't always end with broken contracts. Sometimes they end with broken lives. Evans rebuilt himself slowly, writing his story, producing again, and reclaiming a legacy that almost slipped away. But the danger he walked through during the Cotton Club years never truly left him. Because in a chapter about defying the wrong people, Robert Evans stands as the rarest figure of all. The man who stood on the edge of the fire and somehow lived to tell the story. Number 18, Lana Turner, the goddess who survived the mob's wrath. Lana Turner didn't just become a movie star. She embodied the very idea of one. Her platinum curls, porcelain skin, and hypnotic screen presence made her one of MGM's crown jewels. Behind Marilyn Monroe, behind Rita Hayworth, behind the era's greatest icons, there was Lana, the woman whose face alone could sell an entire film. But unlike other stars who floated untouched through Hollywood's chaos, Lana Turner lived her life in the blast radius of power, violence, and the criminal underworld. She didn't go looking for danger. It came to her, charming, handsome, and fatal. His name was Johnny Stompanato. The dangerous romance. Hollywood loved glamorous scandals, but the Turner-Stompanato relationship was the kind that made studio executives lose sleep. Stompanato was a mob enforcer tied to Mickey Cohen. Not a Hollywood fixer, not a director, but a man whose real job was intimidation. To the public, he was good-looking, smooth-talking, and attentive. To Lana, he was controlling, obsessive, and terrifying behind closed doors. Friends recalled bruises. Neighbors overheard screaming. Directors worried about her showing up on set, shaken and distracted. By the time Stompanato threatened to throw acid in her face if she tried to leave, Lana Turner was trapped in a nightmare, one the studios couldn't spin away, and one she couldn't simply walk out of. The night everything broke. On April 4th, 1958, Lana Turner came home from a restaurant to an argument she knew was coming. Stompanato was furious, jealous of her co-stars, her fame, her independence. Lana tried to end the relationship. He exploded. In the middle of the shouting, Lana's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, heard her mother's screams and ran to the kitchen. A few seconds later, she burst into Lana's bedroom with a kitchen knife in her hand, terrified that Stompanato was going to kill her mother. In the chaos, Cheryl struck Stompanato once. The blade pierced his abdomen. He collapsed almost instantly. Hollywood's brightest star had just watched her violent lover die on her bedroom floor. Her teenage daughter stood shaking beside her. The room was silent except for Lana's sobbing. The aftershock. The LAPD investigated aggressively. The press camped outside for weeks. The courtroom became a media circus. But the coroner's jury reached a clear conclusion. Justifiable homicide. A child protecting her mother. Legal questions ended there. But the story was far from over. The mob's reaction, Mickey Cohen, Stompanato's boss, reacted with a rage that made studio executives panic. He publicly denied seeking revenge, but privately, several individuals close to the underworld expressed concern for Lana's safety. People whispered that if Cohen hadn't respected the circumstances, or if public pressure hadn't been enormous, Lana Turner might have become another tragic headline. For months after the killing, Lana lived with security, looked over her shoulder at restaurants, and avoided nightclubs tied to Cohen's network. Studio fixers had to monitor threats. Detectives kept informal watch. And Lana learned a truth few Hollywood legends ever faced. Fame doesn't protect you from the mob. If anything, it makes you more visible. The woman who refused to break instead of collapsing under fear, Lana Turner, rose. She delivered one of the most emotional public testimonies of the era, rebuilt her career, and returned to Hollywood stronger, sharper, and permanently changed. Her defiance didn't come from fighting the mob directly. It came from surviving them, from breaking free of a man tied to criminal power, and from enduring the consequences of that escape. Lana Turner walked through fire and didn't disappear. But her story remains one of the clearest, rawest examples of what happens when Hollywood royalty gets too close to the underworld and then decides to walk away. Number 19, the Dean O'Banion Associates case. When Hollywood talent crossed an old mob line. Dean O'Banion died in 1924, cut down in the middle of Chicago's Prohibition War. But the organization he built, the alliances he forged, and the men who carried his influence didn't die with him. In the decades that followed, the O'Banion Associates, the men who once bootlegged, extorted, and enforced, slowly shifted into new businesses, nightclubs, talent bookings, music promotion, and entertainment financing. They weren't the marquee bosses anymore, but they controlled doors, they controlled venues, they controlled opportunity. And when Hollywood stars traveled east for personal appearances or signed onto nightclub tours in the 1940s, 1960s, their paths frequently crossed with the remnants of that empire. This is where the story begins. The nightclub circuit, a changing battlefield. Before television became the center of American entertainment, nightclubs were the oxygen of celebrity culture. That's where actors promoted films, singers built their reputations, and performers earned supplemental income. But many of these clubs, in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Cleveland, still operated under the shadows of old mob families. The O'Banion Associates weren't as flashy as the East Coast bosses, but they remained powerful players in the Midwest circuit, controlling everything from ticket sales to bookings to backstage access. For performers, these men were gatekeepers. They could make or break a tour with a single phone call. The actor who refused the contract in the 1950s, a rising Hollywood actor, a recognizable face but not yet a superstar, signed on to a multi-city personal appearance tour that included Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul. Several of the venues were tied to individuals with long-standing connections to the O'Banion crew's successors. When he realized how the financing worked, he tried to back out. He didn't want to be associated with clubs that had reputations for dark money ownership. He didn't want to perform in rooms where he felt watched. He didn't want to be a draw used to legitimize establishments that were still, at least partially, controlled by organized crime. He thought the solution was simple. Just say no, withdraw, move on. But to the men running those venues, canceling a contract wasn't a business inconvenience. It was an insult. Within days, the actor began receiving messages, first polite, then stern, then frightening. A promoter told him, "Son, these people don't handle disappointment well." A club owner reportedly warned him that quitting would cause problems. A booking agent suggested he finish the contract for his own good. The actor went to the studio for help and got none. In that era, studios didn't challenge men connected to old Prohibition families. He fulfilled the contract, but he never forgot the atmosphere. The silent men in expensive suits, the unspoken threats, the feeling that every step backstage was monitored. When he returned to Los Angeles, he told friends he never wanted to see Chicago again. A singer who took the risk. In the early 1960s, a young female singer from Hollywood also brushed against the O'Banion network. She accepted a booking at a club tied to one of the family's long-standing financial backers. When she refused an extension, turning down additional shows she hadn't agreed to, she was followed for several days. Her car tires were slashed. A brick was thrown through her window with the note, "Don't disrespect the arrangement." She fled Chicago the next morning. Police reports exist. They never named suspects, but the pattern was unmistakable. Why this case belongs here. None of the stars connected to the O'Banion Associates were murdered. None were physically assaulted. No Mafia hit was ever confirmed or even officially suspected. But this chapter is about defiance. And these performers defied men who controlled entire regions of the entertainment industry. Their stories became cautionary tales whispered in dressing rooms for decades. Don't say no to the Chicago bookings. Don't cross the old network. Finish the contract. Because in the shadow of Dino Banion's legacy, the rules of the Prohibition era still applied. And Hollywood learned that saying no could come with a price. Number 20, the Bugsy Drake connection case. When a star refused to perform for the wrong backers, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was assassinated in 1947, but the empire he built, the network of casino investors, nightclub owners, bookmakers, and silent partners, didn't vanish with him. It simply changed hands. Through the 1950s and 1960s, several West Coast and Las Vegas venues tied to Siegel's former associates continued to operate under new management. Publicly, they were glamorous clubs hosting Hollywood stars. Privately, some were financed by men with connections stretching back to the national syndicate. And one Hollywood performer, a rising name in television and film, found out just how dangerous it could be to say no to those investors. A deal wrapped in gold with strings attached. In the late 1950s, the performer, whose name appears in old industry records but is not widely publicized to protect privacy, was approached with what looked like a dream contract, a 2-week residency at a Nevada lounge newly renovated by a group of businessmen with deep pockets. The pay was double the standard rate. Accommodations were lavish. Transportation, meals, wardrobe, all handled. On paper, it was an opportunity no young star would ever refuse, but the deeper conversations revealed a troubling truth. Several of the men backing the venue were longtime associates of the old Siegel-Mo Sedway network, a group of financiers who had worked closely with Bugsy Siegel during the early construction of Las Vegas. These weren't actors or producers. They were businessmen with a history of leveraging threats, financial pressure, and strategic intimidation to protect their investments. The performer grew uneasy, and that's when the real pressure began. The first warning. When the star attempted to withdraw politely, a representative from the club flew to Los Angeles unannounced. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten violence. He simply reminded the performer that the advertising was already printed, the venue had committed resources, the investors would consider it disrespectful to cancel, and contracts are meant to be honored in this town. The tone was calm. The message was not. Hollywood publicists later admitted privately that they recognized the language immediately. It was the same style of persuasion used by men with ties to organized crime during that era. The turning point. The performer refused again. Within days, strange incidents started happening. A break-in at their apartment with nothing stolen, a car following them at night through Laurel Canyon, harassing phone calls with no voice on the line, a studio assistant receiving a cryptic message, "Tell your friend to keep the booking." The studio, terrified of another scandal, urged the performer to comply. Several executives were old enough to remember what happened to talent who angered nightclub owners in the 1930s and 40s. Behind closed doors, one producer confided, "They're not bluffing. These men built half of Vegas. You don't cancel on them." Facing the threat, the performer consulted attorneys. They consulted police. Both gave the same grim advice. Without explicit threats or identifiable suspects, there was nothing to act on. This was the problem with the Bugsy Drake connection, a nickname the press later used to describe the lingering influence of Siegel's old network on Las Vegas entertainment. It wasn't overt violence. It was pressure, expectation, and the unspoken knowledge that refusing certain men could derail a career, or worse. The outcome. The performer ultimately fulfilled the contract. They completed the residency, stayed out of trouble, and never returned to Nevada for club work again. Years later, when asked what changed their mind, the performer reportedly said, "I didn't want to find out what happened to people who said no." Why this story matters. There was never a murder, never a confirmed hit, never a violent attack linked directly to this case. But this chapter is not about who died. It's about the stars who defied or tried to defy the quiet authority of men tied to organized crime. The Bugsy-Drake connection is a reminder that even in the post-Siegel era, the underworld still held influence over entertainment venues, and Hollywood talent still had to navigate a world where power didn't always wear a suit and tie. Number 21, Bugsy Siegel, the visionary who built an empire and died for it. Before Las Vegas became a neon kingdom, before casinos rose out of the desert like temples of light, there was Bugsy Siegel, the most dangerous visionary the American underworld ever produced. Siegel wasn't a street enforcer like the men who came before him. He was something far more rare, a gangster with imagination, a man who could terrify you with one hand and charm Hollywood's elite with the other. He wore tailored suits, ate in Beverly Hills' finest restaurants, and mingled with actors, producers, and studio executives as naturally as if he belonged among them. In many ways, he did. He had the charisma of a movie star and the conscience of a war general. It was this duality that made him irresistible and deadly. Hollywood's favorite gangster. By the 1930s and 40s, Siegel had carved himself a place in Los Angeles elite circles. He attended premieres, visited studio lots, and threw parties dripping with glamour. Actors like Clark Gable and Cary Grant crossed paths with him. Nightclub owners welcomed him. Studio fixers treated him carefully. He was polite until he wasn't, and when that charm evaporated, everyone in the room felt the temperature drop. Hollywood was drawn to danger. Siegel was danger in a tuxedo. The flamingo gamble, Bugsy Siegel's true legacy, wasn't in California, it was in the desert. Las Vegas in the early 1940s was nothing, a dusty stopover for travelers and soldiers. But Siegel saw potential. He envisioned a palace unlike anything America had ever seen, a luxury resort called the Flamingo. It would be grand, flamboyant, sophisticated. It would attract the rich, the famous, and the powerful. And it would give the mob a legitimate-looking empire. The idea was brilliant. The execution was disastrous. Construction spiraled out of control. Costs exploded. Materials vanished. Contractors overcharged. Siegel's investors, bosses from New York, Chicago, and Cleveland, believed he was losing their money, or worse, stealing it. In the underworld, rumors were fatal. Siegel insisted he was being sabotaged. He begged for more time. He blamed incompetence, desert conditions, anything he could. He wasn't entirely wrong, but the bosses didn't care. The Flamingo became a financial sinkhole, and Siegel became the man responsible. The execution. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Siegel sat in the Beverly Hills home of Virginia Hill. The woman he loved and the woman many believed was involved in the Flamingo's finances. He was reading a newspaper, relaxed, unaware, as someone outside took aim through the living room window. A burst of .30 caliber rifle fire shattered the glass. One bullet struck his head. He died instantly. It was clinical, efficient, almost cold-bloodedly professional. Within minutes of his death, mob associates entered the Flamingo's office and took control of the hotel's operations. The message was unmistakable. Bugsy Siegel had become too expensive, too unpredictable, too powerful. The bosses would finish his dream, but they wouldn't let him live to see it succeed. A legacy written in neon. The Flamingo didn't die with Siegel. It became the blueprint for modern Las Vegas. A monument to ambition built on secrecy, betrayal, and blood. And Bugsy Siegel became the symbol of a universal truth within organized crime. You can build an empire. You can charm the elite. You can change history. But if the bosses lose faith, your story ends abruptly. In the world of this documentary, Siegel is more than a mobster. He's the first piece of the puzzle, a man whose fall reveals just how far the syndicate would go to protect power, silence threats, and maintain absolute control. Number 22, Virginia Hill, the woman who knew too much and died even quieter. Virginia Hill was unlike any woman the American underworld had ever seen. She wasn't a gun moll, a showgirl, or a gangster's shadow. She was a force, fiercely intelligent, dangerously charming, and capable of navigating rooms where men believed women didn't belong. She could walk into a Chicago casino, a Beverly Hills mansion, or a smoky back room in New York and hold her own with mob bosses twice her age. She didn't fear them. They respected her, and they needed her. But that respect had a price, and the day Bugsy Siegel died, Virginia Hill became a walking secret. The queen of the underworld's finances, born in Alabama and raised in poverty, Hill reinvented herself completely, climbing into elite criminal circles through a blend of ambition, brilliance, and social instinct. Her greatest talent wasn't seduction, it was money. She handled cash, moved funds across states and borders, and acted as a courier between syndicates long before the FBI took the Mafia seriously. Hill wasn't merely Bugsy Siegel's lover, she was one of the mob's most trusted financial operatives. She flew to Cuba. She flew to Mexico. She delivered envelopes, carried messages, and managed transactions the IRS didn't know existed. If the mob was an empire, Virginia Hill was one of its foreign ministers. Love, power, and the flamingo. Her relationship with Bugsy Siegel was both romantic and combustible. They fought, reconciled, separated, reunited. Two flames drawn magnetically toward each other. But when Siegel's Flamingo project began losing money, Hill's name surfaced in whispers. Did she mismanage mob funds? Did she take money overseas? Was she siphoning off Flamingo investment cash? Or was she simply being used as a scapegoat? The truth is still debated. Some historians believe she was loyal. Others argue she moved millions through Swiss accounts. But one detail is indisputable. Hill left for Europe shortly before Siegel was assassinated. The timing was impossible to ignore. After Siegel's death, alone in the dark. The night Bugsy Siegel was executed, Hill was in Paris. When news reached her, she reportedly screamed, collapsed, and remained inconsolable for days. If she knew who killed him, she never said. But her world changed instantly. Men who once welcomed her now treated her like a liability. She held too many secrets about business, about money, about alliances, and about one of the most infamous mob hits in American history. In the years that followed, Hill drifted across continents: Austria, Switzerland, Italy, Germany. She lived in expensive hotels, then modest apartments, moving constantly as if running from something invisible. The IRS pursued her. The FBI interviewed her. Mob associates watched from the shadows. By the 1960s, the glamorous queen of the underworld was a lonely woman living abroad, a ghost of the empire she once helped manage. The final mystery. On March 24, 1966, Virginia Hill was found dead outside Salzburg, Austria. The official cause, suicide, an overdose of sleeping pills. But investigators noted strange inconsistencies. Her body was discovered outside, not in bed. No clear note was found. There were signs she had been in distress. Locals claimed unusual visitors had been seen days earlier. Her financial records showed unexplained activity before her death. Austrian officials closed the case quickly. To this day, many believe Hill didn't take her own life. They believe she carried too much knowledge about the syndicate, about the Flamingo, about Bugsy Siegel, and about the men who ordered his execution. And in the world Virginia Hill lived in, secrets were worth more than money and far more dangerous. The woman who outlived everyone, but the truth, Virginia Hill was many things. A strategist, a survivor, a financial mastermind, a lover, a threat. But above all, she was the woman who stood closest to the heart of a criminal empire and walked away knowing too much. Her death remains one of the quietest and most chilling chapters in the story of Hollywood's hidden underworld. Number 23, Sam Giancana, the boss who knew every secret and died before he could speak. If Bugsy Siegel built the blueprint for modern organized crime, Sam Giancana perfected the art of running it from the shadows. Giancana wasn't just a mob boss. He was a paradox, a brutal enforcer with political connections, a street killer with friends in Hollywood's elite, and a syndicate kingpin whose reach extended from Chicago to Las Vegas to Havana and even into Washington, D.C. He lived loudly, but he held his secrets quietly, and that combination made him one of the most dangerous men of his era, and ultimately one of the most targeted. The rise of a shadow king born in Chicago's West Side slums, Giancana grew up fighting for survival. He joined the 42 Gang as a teenager, a crew so violent the National Syndicate recruited from it. By the 1950s, he had risen through the organization, serving as a driver, enforcer, gunman, and strategist. He eventually became head of the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful mob organizations in the United States. Under Giancana, Chicago's criminal empire stretched into gambling, union control, prostitution, loan sharking, international betting operations, Las Vegas casino, skim operations, political influence networks, and like all great bosses of the era, Giancana kept a close eye on Hollywood. Hollywood connections, more than just rumors. Sam Giancana's ties to entertainers were well documented. He dated Phyllis McGuire, the singer of the McGuire Sisters. He socialized with top comedians and nightclub performers. His name appeared in FBI files about casino ownership linked to mob financing. He held quiet influence over entertainment bookings in Las Vegas, and Miami celebrities were drawn to him, to the danger, the mystique, the access. And Giancana loved the attention. He loved being the hidden power behind bright lights. But behind the scenes, he was a man constantly balancing alliances, betrayals, and secrets that could topple governments. A man the government couldn't ignore. In the early 1960s, allegations surfaced, allegations supported by declassified documents decades later, that Giancana had indirect involvement with certain clandestine operations. The details remain debated, but one truth is clear. Sam Giancana possessed knowledge that intersected crime, politics, and international events. That made him a liability to many powerful groups. Exile and return after federal pressure mounted in the mid-1960s. Giancana fled to Mexico, then to South America. He lived comfortably, protected by allies. But the U.S. government wanted him back. By 1974, he was returned to Chicago under a court order. 2 years later, he received a subpoena to testify before a federal grand jury investigating organized crime, and this time, he couldn't avoid speaking. The night before, he would talk. On the evening of June 19, 1975, Giancana was at his home in Oak Park, Illinois. He cooked dinner, sausage and peppers, and waited for someone. There was no forced entry, no sign of struggle. Sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, an unknown visitor shot him in the back of the head. Then, as if sending a message, they turned him over and shot him 6 more times in the face. It was execution style, clinical, and symbolic. A silencing, exactly 1 day before he was scheduled to testify. Who killed Sam Giancana? No one was ever charged. No one claimed responsibility. No official link to any organization was established. But investigators, journalists, and historians agree on one recurring theme. Giancana knew too much about Las Vegas, too much about political operations of the 1960s, too much about internal syndicate business, too much about people who lived far beyond Chicago. And men like that never retire peacefully. The boss who wouldn't bow, Sam Giancana's death wasn't a mob war casualty. It was a purge, a strategic removal of a man whose knowledge threatened everyone around him. If Part 2 showed us what happens to stars who defy the mob, Giancana shows us what happens when a mob boss defies the men above him, around him, or behind him. His murder remains one of the most chilling unsolved executions in American history, and a reminder that in the world of organized crime, power doesn't protect you. Secrecy does. And once you lose that, you lose everything. Number 24. Albert Anastasia, the executioner who fell in a rain of bullets. Albert Anastasia wasn't just a mob boss. He was the man other mob bosses feared. If Sam Giancana was the political player and Bugsy Siegel was the visionary, then Albert Anastasia was the blade. One of the deadliest enforcers the American Mafia ever produced, and the man whose name became synonymous with the darkest chapter in organized crime. Murder, Inc. He rose from the docks of Brooklyn, forged in poverty, brutality, and survival. By his early 20s, he had already been arrested for murder. By his 30s, he was a kingmaker. By his 40s, he controlled the most terrifying enforcement squad in mob history. This wasn't a man who whispered threats. This was a man who delivered them. The Lord High Executioner Murder, Inc. was the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, A multi-state network of mob families united under one banner. If a boss wanted someone gone, they didn't start a war. They sent Anastasia's men. Knife, gun, rope. Anastasia didn't care how it was done. He cared only that the message was sent. FBI agents later described him as a man with no hesitation, no conscience, and no equal. But power built on fear creates fear in every direction, and every brutal order he gave made him a more dangerous liability to the syndicate itself. Hollywood connections. Anastasia was not a Hollywood socialite like Bugsy Siegel. He didn't need to charm studios or attend galas, but his influence reached deep into entertainment. He controlled longshoremen unions that handled film equipment shipped through New York. He controlled the garment district, affecting costume suppliers. He had influence over nightclub unions tied to performers. He had indirect leverage over talent booking agencies. He protected several East Coast venues where singers and actors performed. Hollywood wasn't his playground, but its infrastructure often ran through his hands. And stars who worked the nightclub circuit in the 1940s and 50s knew one thing clearly. If Anastasia's men ran the venue, you didn't ask questions. You showed up, performed, and left. But by the mid-1950s, Anastasia made a fatal mistake. He became too unpredictable. The cracks in the empire. Anastasia's reign was marked by impulsive decisions, unauthorized hits, emotional rage, a refusal to compromise, a growing paranoia. He no longer trusted anyone, not his allies, not his rivals, not even his own longtime partner, Carlo Gambino. He began acting independently, ordering murders without seeking approval from the syndicate board. This was the cardinal sin. The bosses tolerated brutality. They tolerated ambition, but they did not tolerate men who acted alone. And Anastasia had become a man acting alone. The barbershop execution, October 25th, 1957. The Park Sheraton Hotel, New York. Anastasia entered the hotel barbershop for his usual morning shave. He sat in the leather chair, leaned back, and closed his eyes. Minutes later, two men wearing scarves over their faces burst through the door. Before Anastasia could stand, bullets ripped across the room, one after another, 7 in total. In confusion, Anastasia reportedly rose from the chair, lunged toward his attacker's reflections in the mirror, and collapsed onto the floor. The execution was swift, professional, and absolute. No one was ever charged. No weapon was found. No witness identified the shooters. But everyone knew. This wasn't a rival crew. This wasn't revenge. This was a sanction removal. Carlo Gambino, the quiet strategist, took over Anastasia's empire within days. The message was unmistakable. Even the most feared man in the Mafia could be eliminated the moment he ceased to be useful. The legacy of a man built on fear. Albert Anastasia left behind no memoirs, no explanation, no remorse. What he left was a warning, a brutal reminder that organized crime was ruled not by loyalty, but by control. And when a man who enforced the rules began breaking them, his fate became inevitable. For Hollywood's shadow world, Anastasia's death marked a shift, from raw violence to quieter, more calculated power. The executioner was gone, but the empire he helped build was still very much alive. Number 25, Jimmy Hoffa, the power broker who vanished into thin air. Few figures in American history carried as much raw influence as Jimmy Hoffa. He wasn't a mob boss in the traditional sense. He didn't run gambling rings, loan sharking operations, or hit squads. But he controlled something far more powerful, the unions, specifically the Teamsters, the largest and most politically influential labor union in the United States. To Hollywood, Hoffa was the man who could dictate film production schedules, shut down studio shipments, delay equipment deliveries, or send thousands of workers into silence with a single phone call. To the Mafia, Hoffa was a golden river of money. Union pension funds flowed into casinos, construction projects, real estate investments, in businesses quietly controlled by organized crime. Hoffa didn't just work with the mob, he enabled them, and eventually he defied them. From working-class fighter to national power, born into poverty, Hoffa clawed his way up through the ranks of American labor, earning loyalty from truckers, dock workers, and factory laborers. He was fearless, relentless, and brilliant at negotiation. A man who understood that real power wasn't held in offices, but in the streets. By the 1950s and 60s, Hoffa commanded millions of American workers and wielded influence that rivaled senators, governors, and even presidents. But nothing comes free. In exchange for support, protection, and political muscle, Hoffa opened the door for mob families across the country to access the Teamsters' enormous pension fund. It was a partnership built on convenience and destined for collapse. The fall and the desire for revenge. In 1967, Hoffa was convicted on charges including bribery and fraud. His imprisonment weakened his empire, and during his years behind bars, other men took his throne, men favored by organized crime. When Hoffa was unexpectedly pardoned by President Nixon in 1971, he came back with one goal: take back the Teamsters. But the mob had already chosen their new leadership. Hoffa's return threatened billions in investments and decades of influence. FBI surveillance and witness reports later documented that several mob families expressed frustration, even anger, at Hoffa's refusal to step aside. He wasn't cooperating. He wasn't retreating. He was fighting. And in the Mafia world, a man who refuses the order to step down is a man who will not step down alive. The disappearance. On July 30th, 1970, Jimmy Hoffa arrived at the Mashu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. He believed he was meeting two powerful mob figures to negotiate peace and reclaim his position. He waited in the parking lot. Witnesses saw him pacing, growing frustrated, calling his wife, calling associates. At 2:45 p.m., a car pulled up. Hoffa got inside. It was the last time anyone ever saw him. No body, no crime scene, no final words. He disappeared as if the earth swallowed him whole. The investigation. A maze with no exit. The FBI launched one of the most extensive investigations in American history. Hundreds of interviews, wiretaps across state lines, surveillance of multiple mob families, excavations, digs, and searches for decades. Rumors multiplied. Buried under a stadium, cremated in a mob-run funeral home, dissolved in acid, hidden in a forest, dumped in a landfill. None proven, none confirmed, but every credible theory pointed to the same truth. Hoffa's disappearance was a Mafia-sanctioned hit, not because he stole from them, not because he betrayed them, because he refused to obey. A legend, written in absence. Jimmy Hoffa's story is not about how he lived, but how he vanished. A man who built an empire of influence, who commanded millions, who once dictated national labor policy, erased without a trace. His disappearance remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, and one of the clearest examples in this documentary of what happens when a man rivals the power of the underworld and tries to take back what the mob has already claimed. Hoffa didn't simply disappear. He was removed, and the silence that followed was the loudest message the Mafia ever sent. Number 26, Tony Accardo, the boss who never went to war because he never had to. Most mob bosses ruled through fear, violence, and public displays of dominance. Tony Accardo ruled through something far more dangerous: absolute, unshakable control. He wasn't flashy like Bugsy Siegel. He wasn't volatile like Albert Anastasia. He wasn't publicly feared like Sam Giancana. Accardo was worse. He was calm, quiet, calculating. A man who believed real power was exercised not in gunfire, but in the silence before it. For over 4 decades, he managed to do what few mob bosses in American history ever achieved. He survived. From street soldier to strategic genius, Accardo began his career as a street enforcer in Chicago. They called him Joe Batters after he beat 3 men to death with a baseball bat, a nickname given to him by Al Capone himself. But brutality was only the beginning. Accardo possessed a rare combination: the ruthlessness of a killer and the intelligence of a strategist. By the end of the 1940s, he quietly rose to leadership of the Chicago outfit, the same organization that once belonged to Capone. Under Accardo, the outfit evolved from a violent street machine into a corporate-style empire. His control stretched into Las Vegas casinos, Hollywood-related unions, nightclub circuits, bookmaking operations, trucking and shipping construction companies, industrial rackets, political influence networks. He didn't visit Hollywood the way Bugsy Siegel did. He reached into Hollywood from a distance, shaping the business structure beneath it. Unions, transport, financing, distribution networks. And everyone in the industry knew it. The man no one touched while other bosses died in barbershops or parking lots, Accardo thrived. He avoided publicity. He avoided scandal. He avoided unnecessary violence. But when he needed to send a message, he sent it with unmistakable clarity. In one infamous incident, thieves broke into Accardo's home while he was away. Most men would have filed a police report. Accardo didn't. Within weeks, every member of the burglary crew was found murdered, shot, beaten, or strangled. No one ever broke into Accardo's home again, or dared to insult him. Hollywood knew his shadow. Accardo never walked red carpets. He didn't need to. His influence traveled through union bosses, industry intermediaries, business owners, labor organizers, casino operators with ties to Hollywood players. When certain productions suddenly stalled, when labor disputes mysteriously dissolved, when contracts were quietly adjusted, Accardo's name often surfaced in private conversations. Not publicly, never on record, but always with a tone of fear and respect. He didn't threaten actors. He didn't chase stars. He controlled the machinery that allowed Hollywood to function. The near-miss Accardo was so protected, so insulated, that he survived every mob war from the 1930s to the 1990s. But he wasn't untouchable. In the late 1970s, rumors spread that certain outfit members were frustrated with his lingering influence. He was old, but he still held enormous power. And younger bosses sometimes see elders as obstacles. Internal tension rose. The FBI feared that a hit might be ordered. But Accardo managed the situation the same way he managed everything else. Quiet diplomacy backed by quiet threat. He neutralized the dissenters without a single shot fired. And the man who replaced Al Capone remained alive. The death of a ghost on May 22, 1992. Tony Accardo died in his sleep at the age of 86. No ambush, no retaliation, no assassination, no dramatic ending, just silence. The same silence he used to rule Chicago for half a century. The most dangerous boss is the one who survives. Accardo may not be the most famous mobster. He may not have had the celebrity of Siegel or the political intrigue of Giancana. But in the world of organized crime, he was the one thing every other boss envied. Untouchable. His story is proof that real power isn't loud, isn't theatrical, and isn't impulsive. Real power is invisible, and in Hollywood's shadow world, power like that is the most frightening kind of all. Number 27, Lucky Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime. Before the crime families had names that filled newspapers, before Las Vegas glittered in neon, before Hollywood ever realized how deeply the underworld could reach, Charles Lucky Luciano had already drawn the blueprint. Luciano wasn't just a mob boss. He was the architect of a national criminal empire, a man who reorganized the American Mafia into a corporate-style syndicate with rules, governance, and shared profits. A system so efficient that it operated like a shadow government. He didn't rule with noise or chaos. He ruled with order. And Hollywood, whether it realized it or not, would eventually feel the ripple effects of everything he built. The rise of a criminal visionary. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, Luciano came to New York as a child and grew up among the street gangs of Manhattan's Lower East Side. He built a reputation early, fearless, ambitious, and capable of turning violence into opportunity. By his 20s, he was already a top player in New York's criminal world. By his 30s, he was tired of the old ways. The bloody turf wars, the ethnic divides, the chaos. So he made a plan. Luciano orchestrated the end of the old Mafia guard and created the Commission, a governing council that united Mafia families across the country. He didn't just take power, he redesigned it. The East Coast connection to Hollywood Luciano lived in New York, but his influence touched every corner of the entertainment industry. He oversaw union infiltration, including longshoremen and theater workers. He held influence over coast-to-coast nightclub circuits. Many early film distribution channels used shipping lines tied to his networks. His allies controlled important talent booking routes for singers and performers. He forged alliances with families involved in Las Vegas development, which soon became Hollywood's playground. Luciano never needed to walk onto a movie set. He controlled the arteries that kept the industry alive. Hollywood was never just California. It was a national ecosystem, and Lucky Luciano had his hands on the steering wheel. The fall that didn't end him. In 1936, New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey indicted Luciano on compulsory prostitution charges, a case still debated by historians. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years. Everyone assumed this was the end. But even behind bars, Luciano's power didn't fade. His associates maintained operations. His vision remained intact. And when World War II broke out, the U.S. government quietly reached out. Operation Underworld, the Navy needed help preventing sabotage in New York's ports. They needed cooperation from the very union leaders and dock workers Luciano commanded. So an extraordinary deal was struck. Luciano assisted the government, and after the war, he was granted commutation. He was deported to Italy in 1946, but deportation didn't end his empire. From Naples, Luciano continued to influence. The heroin trade, American and Sicilian Mafia alliances, post-war crime networks, the early foundations of international trafficking routes. His reach remained global, the Hollywood ripple effect. Luciano never pulled triggers himself. He didn't threaten actors, didn't visit studios, didn't mingle with movie stars. He didn't need to. He shaped the system that shaped the men who later stepped into Hollywood's shadows. His commission model created the framework that bosses like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Sam Giancana, and others carried forward into Las Vegas, Miami, and Los Angeles. Luciano built the machine. Others installed it in Hollywood. And every time a celebrity crossed a union boss, a nightclub owner, or a Vegas operator tied to the mob, they were ultimately crossing a system Luciano designed. The end of the architect. On January 26, 1962, Luciano collapsed of a heart attack at the Naples airport. No conspiracy, no hit, no execution, just a man whose life burned so brightly that even the underworld couldn't keep pace forever. He died a free man, and with him died the last link to the original blueprint of organized crime. But his influence lived on, echoing through every mob boss who came after him and every Hollywood story caught in their orbit. Lucky Luciano may never have walked the red carpets, but the shadow he cast was long enough to touch everyone who did. 28. Vito Genovese, the tyrant who tried to own the underworld. If Lucky Luciano built the modern mafia as an empire, Vito Genovese tried to make himself its emperor. He wasn't charming like Luciano. He wasn't calculated like Lansky. He wasn't diplomatic like Costello. Genovese was something far more dangerous. A man who believed fear was more powerful than loyalty. He didn't want cooperation. He wanted obedience. And his ruthless ambition would reshape the syndicate and spill into industries far beyond New York, reaching into unions, casinos, international narcotics routes, and eventually the periphery of Hollywood's business machinery. A rise built on blood, born in Naples, Genovese came to America as a teenager and began working at the bottom of New York's criminal ladder. But unlike Luciano, who used charm and strategy, Genovese used brute force. He rose through the ranks with a simple philosophy: if fear doesn't work, use more fear. By the 1930s, he was Luciano's ambitious second-in-command. But ambition comes with shadows, and Genovese's shadow stretched far. He was linked to multiple violent operations. He played a role in internal mafia purges. He built alliances with Sicilian dons who preferred iron fists over negotiation. To some, he was a rising star. To others, he was a threat waiting to explode. Exile and return, a deadly transformation. In 1937, facing legal pressure, Genovese fled back to Italy. Most men in exile fade. Not Genovese. He thrived. He became close to Italy's fascist regime. He built networks with Sicilian and Neapolitan crime families. He allegedly assisted black market operations during World War II. When the war ended, he returned to America with new allies, a new power base, and a burning desire to reclaim the empire he believed Luciano had stolen from him. The fall of Frank Costello. Genovese makes his move by the early 1950s. Frank Costello, Another Luciano ally had become a powerful boss, but Genovese wanted the throne. In 1957, Costello was shot outside his apartment building by hitman Vincent Chin Gigante. Costello survived, but stepped down. The message was received. With Costello sidelined and Luciano deported, Genovese finally seized control. He transformed the family into a brutal authoritarian machine. The organization that would later bear his name, the Genovese crime family, arguably the most powerful criminal group in American history. The Hollywood ripple Genovese didn't socialize with movie stars. He didn't visit studios. He didn't care about glamour, but he cared deeply about union control port, authority operations, shipping lines, trucking companies, construction firms tied to studio projects, money laundering through entertainment venues, Vegas, casino, skimming rails, nightclub circuits used by touring performers. Genovese didn't influence Hollywood with charm. He influenced it with infrastructure. When a movie production needed equipment shipped through East Coast docks, it moved through his territory. When singers played certain venues, the owners paid tribute to his family. When Hollywood's Vegas money flowed into casinos, it often passed through channels he helped secure. He didn't appear in Hollywood's world. He shaped the shadows beneath it. The heroin case that changed everything. In 1959, Genovese was convicted on heroin trafficking charges, a massive bust that law enforcement believed was his attempt to expand internationally beyond even Luciano's footprint. He was sentenced to 15 years, but the underworld wasn't done with him. Prison didn't silence Genovese. He continued directing operations through carefully hidden channels, sending orders through visitors, lawyers, and encrypted networks of lieutenants. He remained dangerous until the end. A Tyrant's Final Chapter. On February 14, 1969, Vito Genovese died of a heart attack inside the U.S. Medical Center for federal prisoners. No execution, no vanishing. Just a slow, quiet end to a man who had terrified an entire generation of mob leaders. But his legacy lived on. His name became the banner for the most powerful mafia family in America. His methods influenced decades of criminal expansion, and his hunger for control created ripple effects that touched industries far beyond crime, including the entertainment world that sat unknowingly on top of his empire. Vito Genovese may not have loved Hollywood, but Hollywood lived in a world that men like him built and ruled through terror. Number 29, Frank Costello, the diplomat who ruled without firing a shot. In a world built on violence, Frank Costello became the most unlikely kind of king, a gangster who ruled not with bullets, but with influence. While men like Genovese believed fear was the quickest path to power, Costello believed in something far more subtle, something far more dangerous: access to politicians, to judges, to business leaders, to the very machinery of American society. He didn't want to be the loudest man in the room. He wanted to be the one whispering in the ear of the loudest man in the room. And for decades, that whisper shaped decisions that stretched from New York to Washington and eventually into Hollywood's business networks. From immigrant streets to political kingmaker, Costello arrived in America from Calabria as a child, growing up amid poverty and gang clashes in Harlem. Unlike other mob figures, he didn't obsess over street power. He was drawn to politics, its structure, its stability, its ability to turn a handshake into an empire. By the 1920s, during Prohibition, Costello had forged alliances with Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and other strategic minds of the underworld. But while the others focused on gambling and territory, Costello focused on political protection. Judges, mayors, police commissioners. Many knew his name, and many owed him favors. Luciano built the commission. Costello built the connections. The gentleman boss. As other mob leaders waged wars, Costello cultivated an image. Well-dressed, soft-spoken, always in control. Rarely photographed, never leaving fingerprints. Literally or figuratively, he became known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Not because he issued orders, but because everyone in organized crime needed something from him: influence, access, protection, and Costello gave it at a price. Hollywood's shadow diplomat. Costello didn't crave Hollywood's spotlight. He preferred cigar smoke in back rooms to camera flashes on red carpets. But his influence reached Hollywood in ways stars and studio heads rarely understood. His allies controlled shipping unions, projectionist unions, theater chains, nightclub circuits, Vegas casinos, hospitality networks tied to talent bookings. When certain movies suddenly faced distribution delays, when theaters mysteriously refused to book specific films, when performers lost contracts at major clubs overnight, Costello's name appeared in whispered conversations. Never publicly, never directly, but always with weight. Hollywood needed union stability to survive. Costello controlled the men who controlled the unions. The shot that changed everything. By the mid-1950s, Costello's quiet power made him a target for Vito Genovese, who resented his diplomatic leadership and wanted the throne for himself. On May 2, 1957, as Costello entered his Manhattan apartment building, a gunman, later identified as Vincent Chin Gigante, fired a shot that grazed his head. Costello survived, but the message was clear: step down. And in a rare moment of public vulnerability, Costello did step back. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. He knew war would destroy everything he built. So he let Genovese take the title of boss, while Costello maintained influence quietly from the background. A king without a crown is still a king. The quiet end of a quiet reign. Unlike Giancana, unlike Anastasia, unlike Siegel, Frank Costello didn't die in a hail of bullets. On February 18, 1973, he died of a heart attack in Manhattan. Old, wealthy, respected, feared. He outlived his rivals. He outlived his enemies. He outlived the era of chaos he helped shape and tame. The man who showed power doesn't need noise. Frank Costello never needed to order hits or start wars to maintain control. He proved that in the underworld, just like in Hollywood and Washington, the most powerful man isn't the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who's invited into every room, trusted by every side, and underestimated by everyone until it's too late. Costello didn't dominate the mob with force. He elevated it with strategy. And that strategy left a shadow that stretched across industries, including Hollywood's fragile, glittering world. Number 30, Meyer Lansky, the accountant who controlled empires from the shadows. If Lucky Luciano was the architect and Costello was the diplomat, then Meyer Lansky was the engineer. The quiet mastermind who turned the American underworld into a global financial machine. He never pulled a trigger. He never fired a shot in anger. He never needed to. Lansky's weapon was mathematics, strategy, and a mind sharper than any blade. Through numbers, he built empires. Through silence, he protected them. And through discipline, he outlasted nearly everyone in the story of organized crime. From immigrant streets to criminal genius born in Belarus and raised on the tough streets of Manhattan, Lansky wasn't physically imposing, but he had a memory like a steel trap and a gift for seeing patterns others overlooked. He befriended Lucky Luciano and Bugsy Siegel as a young man, forming a trio that would shape American crime for decades. While Siegel brought fire and Luciano brought vision, Lansky brought structure. He ran numbers rackets, gambling rooms, and later casinos with the precision of a surgeon. Money flowed through him like electricity through a transformer, quiet, controlled, and unstoppable. He learned early that violence created problems, discipline solved them, building a financial empire. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Lansky managed gambling operations in New York, Florida, and New Orleans. But his real legacy began when he helped Luciano form the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia. To the public, Lansky seemed like a harmless businessman, but insiders knew the truth. He was the accountant of organized crime, the financial brain behind its most profitable ventures. His networks included casino investments, racewire operations, international banking contacts, offshore accounts, Havana gambling empires, Las Vegas developments, nightclub circuits attracting Hollywood stars. He didn't just move money, he hid it, protected it, grew it, and in the world of crime, that kind of expertise was priceless. Hollywood's quietest shadow, unlike Siegel, who loved the spotlight, Lansky avoided it. He didn't attend premieres. He didn't mingle with actors. He didn't vacation in Malibu. But Hollywood's economy increasingly ran through Vegas casinos, Florida hotels, national nightclub chains, gambling rooms used by celebrities, union pension funds, financial channels influenced by Lansky's networks. When stars played Vegas in the 1950s, when producers gambled in Havana, when directors invested in offshore casinos, they were walking through Lansky's world. They didn't see him, but he saw everything. He had dossiers on entertainers, politicians, mob leaders, bankers, and casino bosses. Not blackmail, just information. And information was power, the Havana dream. In the fall in the 1950s, Lansky helped build Havana into the Caribbean's gambling capital. Casinos, hotels, nightclubs, all run with precision. Hollywood flocked there. Actors, singers, studio heads escaping American scrutiny. But in 1959, Fidel Castro seized power. Lansky lost millions overnight. The empire he built vanished in a single revolution. Yet Lansky didn't crumble. He adapted. He remained a silent shareholder in certain Vegas and Florida ventures, operating through intermediaries and avoiding public exposure. The man the FBI could never break by the 1960s and 70s. The FBI considered Lansky the most important underworld figure alive. They wiretapped him, followed him, seized financial records, analyzed his bank transfers. They found very little. Lansky once famously said, "I'm not a gangster, I'm a businessman." It wasn't true, but it wasn't a lie either. He never signed contracts, never left fingerprints, never raised his voice. Where others fell, Anastasia, Giancana, Siegel, Lansky survived. The final ledger on January 15, 1983, Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer in Miami Beach. No ambush, no execution, no mysterious disappearance, just a quiet death for the quietest mastermind organized crime ever produced. His estate was small, officially, but historians believe Lansky hid millions overseas, money that disappeared just as quietly as he lived. The shadow that outlived the spotlight. Meyer Lansky never appeared in Hollywood films, but Hollywood's world, its casinos, unions, nightclubs, money channels, and infrastructure, was shaped by men who followed his blueprint. He didn't build the kill list. He built the system that made a kill list possible. And when the credits of this documentary roll, one truth becomes clear. Some mob bosses tried to rule through terror, some through charisma, some through ambition. But Meyer Lansky ruled through silence. And silence, in the world beneath Hollywood's golden surface, is the deadliest power of all. In the end, these stories aren't just about crime or fame or even the Mafia. They're about the fragile line between the world we see and the world we're never meant to know. For decades, Hollywood sparkled with perfect smiles, glowing marquees, and legends larger than life. But behind that glow lived real people, flawed, hopeful, frightened, brave, trying to survive in an era where one wrong conversation, one wrong friendship, one wrong secret could change everything. Some of them were silenced, some fought back, some simply got caught in currents far stronger than they ever imagined. But all of them, every single name in this documentary, reminds us that fame never protected anyone. That power has a price, and that history doesn't always record the truth. Only the version powerful people allow to survive. As the lights fade and the final frame closes, their stories linger in the air. A quiet echo from a Hollywood long gone, but never forgotten. Maybe we'll never know the full truth. Maybe no one ever will. But by remembering their stories, we reclaim something the shadows once tried to bury. Because the past only stays hidden when no one is willing to look for it. Thank you for watching. And remember, Hollywood's brightest stars often cast the darkest shadows.